have the third presentation now by Lukas Meier and Alice Hein. The two of you going to present. Lukas Meier from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom and Alice Hein from the Technical University of Munich, Germany. Their presentation is building an algorithmic advisory system for moral decision-making in the healthcare sector. The floor is yours, and you have the slides almost up. Here they are.
Yeah, thank you. Can you see that in full screen?
Yeah, everything is fine. So it's your turn. Okay,
so from an analysis of harm sort of to a tool that can cause harm if we don't do it properly. Because what we've done here is try to develop an algorithm that could calculate ethical decisions. So when you have an ethical question, especially in the clinic, we wanted to create a tool that could take such a decision. Now, to preface this, this was sort of a pilot project. This is not yet meant for clinical application, or maybe not at all. So let's see. But it's also like a test case whether we can actually do it. So what are we going to do today? I'll briefly explain why such a tool could be helpful, and then Elise and I both will tell you how we did it. So the ethical underpinnings, the sort of technical solution behind it. We'll show you some example cases, how the tool actually works, and then briefly talk about limitations and questions. Okay, medical AI in the clinic. What does it do so far? We've heard some examples today already. So you can interpret medical images, analyze cardiograms, diagnose certain conditions. But so far, the ethical realm has sort of been spared from sort of automation. Does it make any sense to automate in this realm? Could you automate? What could you automate? Classic dilemmas are decisions that need to be taken at the beginning or the end of life, patients who refuse treatment that is beneficial or request treatment that is not beneficial to them, issues of confidentiality, and so on and so forth. Here are some examples. Should doctors continue treating a child who still has a small chance of long-term survival against her will? So that would be a classic dilemma. Should one carry out a procedure that has adverse medical effects when the patient insists on receiving the treatment? Should medical personnel try to save a patient's life following a suicide attempt when she, the patient, had signed a do not resuscitate order many years ago? So you can feel the tension, I hope, that lies within those cases. And usually they go to clinical ethics committees. Problem is that those committees are increasingly overwhelmed. Now, especially during the pandemic, too many cases had to be decided within short time frames. And maybe algorithms could help there, so at least in emergency situations. So that was the idea. Certainly they would be quicker at taking those decisions. Another question is whether they would also be more accurate. That brings us to the problem of what accuracy is in moral, sort of in the moral domain anyway, because there's sort of nothing that is objectively correct, I suppose. Okay, how did we do it? First step, we needed to choose a moral framework. And as you probably know, there are like three main theories in the moral domain: consequentialist or Kantian theories, utilitarian, deontological theories, that's Kantian theories, and virtue ethical. And they're familiar with from cases like the one you see on the right. So most people prefer utilitarian decision rules for their car, so save as many people as possible. But when they themselves are in the car, they want something else, namely that the car protects them at all costs. And this is obviously, I mean, you can't have both at the same time. So there's a problem. Those theories have different weaknesses anyway. So for consequentialism, as you probably know, there could be cases where you should actually kill an organ donor in order to save 8 more lives, roughly 8 maybe, depending on how many organs are still usable. For deontology, we have other problems. So some actions are prohibited. You could, for example, not lie in order to protect someone from killer or whatever. I won't go into the details. So these are just the problems that those theories have. Now, luckily in medicine, there's an overarching agreement, at least most people believe, that there are 4 principles we can rely on: beneficence, non-maleficence, respect for patient autonomy, and justice. So those are pretty well entrenched in the clinics worldwide. Well, at least in the Western world, because autonomy is not, it's not entrenched everywhere. But those were the principles we tried to operationalize here. So attend to the patient's welfare, do not inflict evil or harm, act on the basis of patients' choices and values. And the 4th one we didn't operationalize for reasons we can go into Q&A if you like. Next step was analyzing interactions that take place in the clinic in order to acquire the input variables we need. Because, I mean, you'd have to tell the algorithm what kind of case it is and which variables you need for that. We try to glean from actual interactions in the clinic. And this is the user interface we then developed. That was Alice's doing. So she put in all these variables so that you could sort of grasp any clinical case. So for example, you'd input the patient's current quality of life and the likelihood that the envisioned therapy would increase or decrease the quality of life. Here we have variables that deal with autonomy. So is there an advanced directive? What does the next of kin say? And so on and so forth. It's a lot of variables. 3rd step, the data set. Every algorithm needs a data set, and we wanted it to be as representative as possible, of course. So we had a lot of different case types that usually occur in the clinic. I mean, it's not very important which types these are here. The biggest question was, where do we get the data from? So at first we thought, let's take surveys, but then we found that the cases are too complex to really pose them to lay people in the street. Also, we didn't want to use our own ethics committee because that would have sort of biased it towards that particular clinic we were working at. We were also looking at court cases, but that wasn't much better either because the laws differ a lot between countries, so that other variables also play a role, not just ethical variables sort of in court cases. And we didn't want those to influence the results we got. So in the end, we used case collections from the literature that were sort of compiled from different countries. So in order to have a very diverse data set. Of course, the data set is pretty small so far because it's just a test data set, so we couldn't be using it for actual clinical application. Although the accuracy is not as bad as Alice will tell you now.
Yeah, so once we had collected our data set, we needed to find an algorithm or like a model class that could learn from this data that we had collected. And this we thought about quite a bit because we had some constraints in that maybe if you saw the numbers in the slide before, we don't have a very big data set here, especially when you compare it to the big like ChatGPT and all the models that are taking over the world right now. Those are like trillions of data points, and we had maybe 70 cases. So it had to be a kind of model that could deal with a small data set, that could learn something reasonable from a small data set. And we also wanted to at least be somewhat able to see why it was doing what it was doing, because that was part of why we're trying to build this kind of algorithm to see what it would learn and if it would make sense. So what we ended up with is something called a fuzzy cognitive map, where you can see it in small on the right here. I think there's a bigger picture later on. Yeah, maybe go back for now. So what it is, it's basically just a graph, and it has a bunch of nodes where we decide what these nodes stand for. So a node in this graph could be, for example, the age of the patient, or their decisional capacity, or the loss of quality of life that we expect from a medical intervention. And we as the designers decide what this means. So that's in contrast to like a deep neural network where all the neurons they don't have a semantic meaning, at least not a human understandable one. The model just decides on its own what it's going to do with the different neurons. In this case, we really say, okay, this means this, and this stands for that. And then we also draw different weights between, or connections between the different nodes. So for example, decisional capacity and age are allowed to influence the autonomy node, so the node that stands for autonomy. but we don't allow it to influence, for example, the loss of quality of life expected from an intervention, because that wouldn't make sense. So we impose these kind of constraints on the graph, which leads to what you see on the right, which is the model that we came up with. What we don't give upfront, like what is not human specified, is we don't say how much weight each connection should have, and we don't say what the polarity of the weight is. So we don't say if you're older, you have more autonomy, or if you're younger, you have more autonomy. We don't say we don't say if it's a positive or a negative connection between two nodes. We don't say how strong the connection is. That's all learned by a genetic algorithm, but we do set up the architecture, you could say. So it has the benefit that it doesn't require a lot of data. You can learn with a genetic algorithm from a pretty small data set, and you can visualize this intuitively with this kind of causal graph. And it's also easy to extend. So like we talked about before, we didn't use justice in this first prototype, but you could, in theory, put another node there and thereby make it a more complete or bigger model. Yeah, so this is the bigger version, in case you want to read what the different nodes say. We also have a website where you can, I think, check it out afterwards if you're interested. Read it in more detail. So then we evaluated our model. Once we trained it with, we evaluated with k-folds cross-validation, which is a procedure you can use when you have pretty small data sets to see how robust the results are. And we had a deviation from the training labels on average of 0.11 in the training data set and 0.23 in the test data set. So just for reference, this is between 0 and 1. So a decision, what it spits out in the end is something between 0 and 1, which is 0, don't do the intervention, and 1 is yes, definitely do whatever intervention this case is about. So a deviation of 0.11 would, for example, be if the medical expert says, this is a 0.4, so that's slightly below the threshold of 0.5 that we set for. If it's above 0.5, do the intervention. Below 0.5, don't do the intervention. If the expert says 0.4 and the model says 0.29, that would be a deviation of 0.11. And then the agreement with our ethicists, if you do like the binary criterion, so above 0.5 would be yes, below 0.5 would be a no. Then the agreement with our ethicists was 92% of the cases in the training set and 75% of the cases in the test set. And I think we have some example cases to make it, to maybe show you what this looks like for a specific case. So this is a case of a 15-year-old patient. She's suffering from leukemia, and she has been for the past 9 years. And she could receive chemotherapy, which would yield an additional year of life, but it would reduce the quality of life significantly. And this particular patient prioritizes quality of life over extension of life, and she wants to die at home. And now the question is, should the intervention, so this refers to the chemotherapy in this case, should this intervention be attempted? And on the right, you can see how this kind of case unfolds in the model. So you give it all the input parameters, the patient's age, and so on, what their preference is. And then you see on the right here, activation of the different concepts, so the different nodes that we talked about in the graph. And on the x-axis, you have time steps. So you let all the different concepts influence each other over time, and you see what happens in the end, like where the algorithm ends up. What's relevant here is, or especially relevant, is the gray line, which shows the intervention concept. And the black line, the black dotted line, is what the expert says is the correct answer in this case. So correct is always, you can debate it in this kind of domain, but this is what our expert said. So you see here that the gray line begins rising, because obviously this intervention chemotherapy would increase the lifespan of this patient, and that's normally a good thing. But the beneficence, which is the orange line, is actually not very high if you do that, because it leads to a year of suffering basically for the patient. Maybe the reason why it rises in the beginning is because the autonomy of the patient, the blue line, is at about 70% or so, because this is a minor, it's not like an adult patient. But the gray line starts falling shortly after, like around 5 or 10 time steps, as the beneficence is pretty low. And you see that as the intervention falls, so as it tends towards not doing the chemotherapy, beneficence starts rising. They kind of cross over in the middle, and the intervention ends up at around 0.2, which is where it should end up according to our experts. So that's a case where actually things worked out the way they were supposed to. Yes. So that's, I'm not sure what kind of case this is, but just to see in action what it looks like. You can see it's kind of unfolding over time. It's another case. Yeah. So you can kind of track the different concepts, activations, and you actually know what each concept stands for, as I said, in contrast to the deep learning models. This is a case where we thought it was interesting, even though it's not really desirable behavior on the part of the model. It's, I think, interesting. It's a case where a patient has, I'm not sure, overdose or something, and they have signed an advance directive that says do not resuscitate in a case like this, and then their spouse says yes, please resuscitate. Ignore what they said. Resuscitate my spouse. And what you have here on the right in purple is the advance directive of the patient, and in brown you have the opinion of their spouse, of their next of kin. And you can see they're kind of in conflict. So the purple line is higher, it has more weight, which is correct. In these kinds of cases, the patient's advance directive should carry more weight than what the surrogate says. But you can see that they kind of work against each other, such that the model starts oscillating into eternity. So it never really reaches that nice equilibrium that we showed before. If I don't stop it, like, it's just gonna run on forever in that exact pattern. So you can kind of see the inner conflict, if you want to call it that, of the model in a case like this, which there is a bunch of research on how you can avoid this kind of oscillation, but we thought it was interesting behavior.
Okay, then I'm taking over again, just with sort of conclusion. Should we employ this algorithm or not, or tools of this kind in general? So of course there's great potential, as we've already mentioned, in pandemics or other bigger health emergencies, when sort of the committees are overwhelmed. AI could help. Maybe it could also help in sort of people's daily lives, right, at the clinic, because the demand is always high. So maybe could decide cases that aren't as important or not as controversial or whatever. On the other hand, there are also great risks. We've heard a lot about that already today, so I don't think we need to get into too much detail here. Dataset, our dataset is way too small. We need a much larger dataset. Then the question is, where should you collect those cases in order to make a representative? We have bias issues. You can never be sure that you have all variables, that you've grasped all variables you really need, and so on and so forth. And then there's sort of the human element that sort of human committees provide, of course, of which empathy is an important part. And in our case, even if the outcome would be the same, which is even if it was the same, which is obviously what we desire it to be, still it would be sort of a cold calculation. And the question is whether people would like that, also relatives, the patients themselves, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is the main paper. Stirred up quite a controversy. We got mixed replies. Some people found this to be a very good idea. Some people hated it. So yeah, and then a larger debate. And we actually 4 people, so Alice and I, and 2 professors from the Technical University of Munich. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an interesting approach. Yeah, thoughts, comments, questions? Curious to hear what you think, the others in the audience.
What do you think? Good idea or bad idea?
You know, I mean, I am a visiting professor at an AI research institute right now, and they present all kinds of approaches. They are doing all sorts of research, and I mean, somehow what you presented sounds familiar in that regard. On the other hand, they have not attempted so far to find a way to simulate the ethical decision-making process. It may just be them, or it's probably just them, and that's a fantastic idea on the one hand to try to do this. I can see this. On the other hand, why did you choose this approach? I mean, isn't this the last thing we would try to do? Isn't the ethics decision making the thing we would claim that this is where human beings are needed? On the other hand, you show that no, they are not, they may not be needed, at least in some of the cases. Yeah, I don't know. That's a pretty general question.
Yeah, no, we agree. So that was actually exactly what Alice and I were saying when the project was concluded. So it was a good idea to do that as a pilot in order to safeguard against what might come along the way if other people did it. But we said exactly the same thing, namely, this should be the last domain we should entrust to AI. So there might be a lot of other domains we'd be more comfortable, and even in that case we wouldn't be too comfortable, but we might be more comfortable in comparison to ethics in handing it over to AI.
I think what interested me about the project was not so much like building something that would actually take over decisions of this kind for humans. It's more maybe it's just because I'm an engineer, but that I mean, people seem to be making decisions all the time based on some kind of invisible rule, something intangible. And I thought it would be interesting to try to build a model that would extract from empirical data what people are acting on and try to maybe codify it, like like write it down, have it somehow computerized in a way. And that's a big part of the project we actually just spent on what kind of variables can you break a case down into, because people don't think about it that way when they mostly, I think, medical ethicists, they just sit down and talk about it and they have a lot of intuitive knowledge, but it's not really written down and it's not really broken down into variables or parameters. And that's what I thought was interesting about doing this project for me.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, this was so fast, you showed the architecture, but how you build this up, because the experts, they probably just said, okay, I think A is the right thing, or I think B is the right thing, or something. But you kind of connected these nodes in a certain way, and how you did this, and it seems to work. I mean, that's a really interesting approach, because when you think of, or when I think about ethics, I don't think in these connections. I doubt whether others do, but the mere fact that you managed to build up this architecture and that it seems to work is kind of fascinating.
I think Lukas can attest to that. Our medical ethicists also didn't think in this kind of structure. It's something I kind of forced on them because I needed variables to calculate something, right? Yeah. But I think it's an example of how when you do these kinds of interdisciplinary projects that it really helps to like sitting together with people from different disciplines and getting different perspectives on a problem. I think you come up with, you need it. If I don't think I couldn't have built this without people explaining to me how medical ethicists usually look at a case. And I don't think medical ethicists would have broken it down this way. So I think it was like a symbiotic kind of project.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, fantastic. Also, there are two hands. Oh, I was sorry. I didn't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No worries. It's also making assumptions that are implicit, explicit. That's also what it did, right? And when we evaluated which variables come up in these case discussion and hence needed to be sort of put into the algorithm, it's only then we realized what comes up every now and again in those discussions, and the people we're talking with, they didn't know that. That was sort of implicit. Of course, it was somewhere in their head, but they couldn't have provided us with a list.
Yeah, there's. Thank you. There are two hands raised. Claire, it's your turn, and then Dane is next.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, just a quick comment and then a question. I think that's really interesting, the sort of framing in which you're talking about, like, looking at how using this brings forth all these new questions and maybe like concerns about in what domains we should be using these tools and how it relates to current ethical decision making. But what's interesting is, like, from a philosophy bioethics perspective, though a lot of everyday ethical decision making is quite sort of intuitive and implicit, sometimes, like in analytic philosophy, things can get quite technical and precise, and also a lot of the ethical and regulatory guidelines in medicine get quite specific and almost like list-based in certain contexts. So I think it's really interesting that if you got such a sort of sort of some pushback on this, what that might imply about some of the other ways in which we go about ethical reasoning in these specific fields. I think that's really an interesting question. But also, you mentioned right at the start of the presentation that you didn't sort of incorporate the justice element of the principalism approach for certain reasons. I'd love to hear more about the difficulties of incorporating that, or your decision to not do that.
Yeah, thank you. Good question, of course. So, I mean, that's something we've been struggling, or we had been struggling with for quite a while. The problem is that the different jurisdictions and also the different healthcare systems have very different, very divergent ideas as to what justice is supposed to be, right? If you compare the Canadian system to the one in the US, to the NHS, the British NHS, for example. Those systems are so fundamentally different in terms of what they regard as just, that there was no way we could sort of put that into one algorithm without making sort of unwarranted political decisions. So, like adopting the Canadian system. And that we didn't want to do because it was supposed to be universal, or as universal as possible. So that's why we couldn't do it. Or, we could probably do it if we built an algorithm that was only applicable in certain regions. So if you were willing to bite that bullet, then you could do it, I suppose. But it would be hard to get it right if it sort of were to be working across borders.
Also, yeah.
Really? Oh, sorry, you go. I have a little follow-up question after that.
Because I mean, we considered it in the beginning. And algorithmic fairness in itself is like, it's such a big field, and people propose new metrics all the time, and they kind of contradict each other. You can't like fulfill all of them. It's like 30 different metrics that you could try to use to like calculate fairness, because you need to calculate it somehow to put it into the model. So it would definitely be an interesting challenge, I think, to extend the model in that way. But we left it out for the first prototype.
Oh, that's so interesting. Just really quickly, a follow-up question is, do you think that there's sort of a stark contrast between the principle of justice and the other principles, or do you think maybe to a lesser extent some of those questions arise in the other principles as well? Like, for instance, in beneficence, thinking about how we operationalize or think about like quality of life, or there's a lot of questions popping up about how we understand autonomy and sort of a lot of decisions that might come in there too. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very good point. So that was also something we discussed. So why is it that justice seems to be the odd one out there? So intuitively, I think the first two, beneficence and non-maleficence, they are pretty universal. Also, since they're mirror images of one another, if you have both, you can't go that wrong. So most people would agree on that. Autonomy is already a little thornier because non-Western countries usually don't value it as highly, as you know. So that is a little different, but we thought we could still do it. But justice is really political. That was the main problem. It is political, and it has to do with legislation, although that also goes for autonomy partly. But the way we solved that with autonomy, so we didn't, for example, put into the user interface like, is the patient above or below the age of 18? That would have caused the same problems. So what we did put was, has the patient reached the age of majority? But even then, you know, you have exceptions, I think, especially in Canada, and that's in this particular issue, with this particular issue. But in the end, it worked a little better for that one than it would have been working for justice.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dane, you are next with your question.
Yes, hi. I see we're almost out of time. I do apologize for not being able to get my camera working today. Tomorrow I will talk about, sort of give some pushback in my talk to Robert Sparrow's paper against the possibility of moral machines, wherein he tries to trigger some intuitive moral objections to the very idea of using an AI for moral decisions. So his intuition, and he thinks that it resonates with most people, is that it's kind of flippant to do that, that it's we're not taking the problem seriously enough. But the interesting irony, I think, in these dilemma cases is that there is no clear-cut right or wrong answer. And if we can see that some, at least in his case, he's talking about a moral advisor, where the ultimate decision, so you take the input of the advisor and then you make the decision, obviously the responsibility stays with the human. So the problem isn't about the responsibility, it's just this general idea that we're being flippant, we're not giving enough, I don't know, we're not suffering enough through the problem. In the end, it almost is a matter of flipping a coin in these true dilemma type situations. That's what makes the dilemma. So I guess this is just more of a comment to say that I think we can question that intuition about flippancy and that we're not giving it enough weight. I almost think that the more information we can get, the more help we can get in these decisions, the better. It's not, I think you can sort of reframe the offloading objection to one of sort of recruiting additional kinds of tools and resources. So I think, yeah, that was, if you had any thoughts, but sorry, it ended up being more of a comment.
Shall I, please, or do you want to? I mean, in a sense, you've answered your own question already, right? I think, so making variables explicit that are implicit is not taking it less seriously, but more. That's certainly taking it more seriously. And there's nothing that sort of hinders us in using artificial intelligence in parallel to human sort of decision making, right? So, I mean, we're more often wrong than not. And even if there's no sort of objectively correct answer to a lot of things, you know, as you said, another perspective wouldn't hurt. Also, we thought this tool could be used, you know, if you don't want to use it in the clinic, which we don't really want to do. This could, for example, be used in order to sharpen people's moral perception. Yeah, for young ethicists, aspiring doctors, whatever. They can train with the tool. They can see where they agree, where they disagree, and they can play around with the variables and see how that changes the outcome, and then think, you know, have a think if that's the same in their head or not, and why. So I think it would actually be helpful rather than taking things less seriously.
Yes, I agree. And so bottom line, I think it's a good idea, particularly as a test kind of case. But yeah. Thanks.
Alice, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you said everything.